Have you ever felt like an exile in your own hometown? I begin my journey from here, though of course Greece itself will never admit this to you. Its status simply does not allow it, and this city had to be built almost from scratch. So do not believe those who tell you that something ancient stands before you when pointing at this statue. In Antiquity, everything was somehow larger, brighter, more majestic, wasn't it? And so am I, merely a marginalia in the margins of this ancient scroll. Palimpsest. Such is the name given to ancient papyri, parchments, books, or even stone tablets, upon the original text of which someone in later times inscribed a new one. Almost every city, in its own way, is such a palimpsest. And, naturally, the older the city, the more layers it possesses. Athens. To think of it, it's already a kind of philosophy. It is a city ancient enough to afford itself the right to be weary. It is difficult to imagine a 90-year-old lady pole vaulting or practicing the hammer throw, so I urge you to be indulgent when you resolve to come here. Hold the door open for this old woman. It is never easy for me to speak of this city. Too much of a deeply personal nature is bound up with it. Have you ever felt like an exile in your own hometown? Not the kind of exile you feel at 14, but a true refugee. A person stripped of their skin, without prospects and without hope. As if you were a citizen of a country that no longer exists, speaking a language dead to those around you. Perhaps this is some strange effect of Athens, but I have heard such confessions from many of my acquaintances, not only from those who were born and raised here, but also from those who moved here well into their adulthood. I begin my journey from here, from the district of Pagrati, which is a stone's throw from the central city park, the former royal garden. In recent years, this area has become popular with certain French students, young families, tall Scandinavians, and American hitchhikers. In short, an unusual and creative crowd. Once upon a time, an Oscar winner, a Nobel laureate in literature, and a president of Greece all lived in this neighborhood. Nevertheless, the memory of these people, if not in words, then by some lingering spirit, still lends Pagrati an air of aristocracy. Paris was called the City of Light, by no means for its street lighting, but for people who lived in it. So it is with Pagrati, a district of light. Generally, Athens has always gravitated toward Paris, and Greece as a whole toward France. Though of course Greece itself will never admit this to you. Its status simply does not allow it. Yet by an artist's stroke, one can often discern from whom they borrowed this or that line. And it was impossible not to borrow. Athens became the capital of Greece a mere 200 years ago, and this city had to be built almost from scratch. Arcades, cafes, dozens and hundreds of Greek painters, sculptors and writers who had studied in France all appeared at that very time. Of the latter, however, nothing remains now but the bookshops, likewise a very Parisian phenomenon. A long-time acquaintance of mine, a great lover of the simple, old-fashioned book, once stumbled in this shop upon a wonderful edition of Russian fairy tales translated into Greek, illustrated by Ivan Bilibin. Scarcely will this name mean anything to people far removed from the history of Russian painting, but his illustrations for Russian fairy tales are as textbook in their authority as Gustave Doré's engravings for the Divine Comedy or Gargantua. After the Bolshevik coup in Russia in 1917, Bilibin, like several million of his compatriots, was forced to leave his home. For some time he lived in Alexandria, Egypt, where he earned his bread and rent by helping local Greek merchants surround themselves with elements of an aristocratic life, decorating their villas and creating ex libris plates for their book collections. By the way, one of Bilibin's clients at that time was Andonis Benakis, the very same man whose art collection subsequently became the museum bearing his name. Andonis Benakis' sister, Penelope, was incidentally also directly involved with children's books. She wrote fairy tales herself as well as entire historical novels. Generations of Greeks grew up on her books, yet outside her native culture she remains completely unknown, even though the pain, feelings and thoughts that run through her texts, like a common thread, are entirely universal to most people in this world. On the 27th of April 1941, when German troops entered Athens without encountering any significant resistance, the 67-year-old Penelope took a lethal dose of poison. She could not reconcile herself to the tragedy that had befallen her beloved country. Less than a year later, in Leningrad, besieged by German forces, Ivan Bilibin, who had returned to his homeland shortly before the war, died of hunger and exhaustion. Even during the siege, he continued to work on set designs for theatrical productions. Sometimes it turns out that one's life is merely a part of someone else's fairy tale, and it is precisely through the example of Athens that this lesson can be very well absorbed. The ancient Athenians revered their old gods in this place. Between two hills lay a slightly smaller and, presumably, slightly rounder stadium, where athletic contests were held in honor of Athena, while up there on the hill, sacrifices were offered at the sanctuary of Tyche, the goddess of fortune. And here, in front of the stadium, a river flowed back then, one of the three main rivers of the city. It is still invisibly with us now, flowing enclosed in a culvert beneath this noisy, dusty avenue. It outlived that ancient stadium, though it lost its former abundance of water. 17 centuries ago, the veneration of any old gods, be it Mars, Ares, Zeus or Jupiter, was banned throughout the Roman Empire. Thus, organized sport also came to an end. Neither games in honor of the Olympian gods, nor contests in honor of individual patron deities remained. That stadium was dismantled for bricks and rebuilt anew only in the mid-19th century, in a completely new Greece. So do not believe those who tell you that something ancient stands before you when pointing at this stadium. "What is that? Some Turk?" an acquaintance of mine once asked, pointing at this bronze equestrian statue. By uttering this in my presence, she was, without knowing it, opening Pandora's box. If we return for a moment to that very France toward which Greece once so gravitated, one might ask the question, who are the French? Celts? Germanics? Romans? No, most likely the French are the French. Voltaire, Dumas, Delacroix, Molière, Richelieu, Descartes, Flaubert, Camus, Lully. Everyone who stands behind our contemporary conception of everything French is France. The French had sufficient time to evolve from Gauls, Germanics and Romans into who they are today, whereas the Greeks did not have this time. Until the 15th century, their world rested on the fact that their great city, Constantinople, was the second Rome. Their emperor was the emperor of the Romans, and they themselves were the last Romans. But with the fall of Byzantium, this world came to an end, and for the next 400 years the Greeks found themselves in a state of almost total cultural subjugation. When a Greek state reappeared on the map of the world in the first half of the 19th century, no one truly understood what the Greek nation ought to represent. Hence arose this self-indulgent obsession with antiquity as something undeniably great and unshakable, before which the entire Western world bows. How else could one remind people who had nearly forgotten their native tongue whence they came upon this scared earth? As for the fashion, yes, it looks a little Turkish. What can one do? I should like to have seen French dresses had France found itself under the dominion of Africans for 400 years. In antiquity, everything was somehow larger, brighter, more majestic, wasn't it? At least it is easy to believe so when looking at these colonnades, rather than, say, at a somber temple like this one. There is your simplest cognitive trap. The majestic ancient-looking temple, the Zapion exhibition hall, was built in the middle of the century before last by a Danish architect of Norwegian descent executing a commission for a Greek from Romania. Meanwhile, this is a thoroughly original, 1,000-year-old temple, having by some miracle alone survived such an insane number of catastrophes. Fires, wars, plague, famine, the collapse of empires, and the changing of religions. Even touching these bricks takes one's breath away. Down there, in the vaults beneath this temple, there still remain the ruins of an ancient Roman bath, upon which, in fact, a Christian chapel was once built, eventually expanding into a temple. Later, there was an Orthodox monastery here, and after that, a Catholic one. When the Greeks attempted to win Athens back from the Turks, the temple was severely damaged, but it still stood. No sooner had this city become the capital than Greeks who had previously been scattered across Europe flooded here, followed by curious foreigners. Until then, Athens had been to them merely a city of ancient myths. Mass construction began, and this temple proved an obstacle. Some grey, dilapidated ruin. A hotel or a restaurant in this spot would have looked far better. But its demolition was prevented by an Orthodox priest from Kiev, who was a member of the Russian diplomatic mission to Greece. He managed to secure funds from the Russian authorities for the restoration of this temple, and when it was completed, it became the embassy church for the Russian legation. Of course, that Russia has long since ceased to be, and this church has just long belonged to the Archbishopric of Athens. Yet among the locals it is still called, out of old memory, the Russian Church. Most of all, I love this city in the earliest hours of the morning, when everyone is still asleep, when everyone is still too indolent to leave their rooms, when even the sun has not yet found the leisure to scorch and burn its ancient dust. Like a sudden half-drunken confession to a bartender when the two of you are left alone in the whole bar just before closing. I have worked as a bartender, so I know whereof I speak. But do you know what is most precious in cities like Athens? Peering into them more closely, you realize that despite all the problems, crises, and catastrophes of this world, something nonetheless remains unshakable. If not forever, then for a very, very long time. A fragment of an 1,700-year-old wall, which failed to protect Athens from being burned by barbarians, lies at the level of the underground parking lot of a modern hotel. Where are those barbarians now? Yet the descendants of those who built this wall, even if only genetically, are still here. They rise at 4:30 in the morning and go to open cafes, to lay out breakfasts in hotels, to brew entire vats of the most aromatic coffee. They too are kind of wall builders. Nameless, unknown to anyone, but where would an entire army go without a single blacksmith to make the nails? For this it all happens, so that we might see these stones, these walls, these windows, and perhaps learn to love a little more than our predecessors, to scrape away the texts of others a little less, and to contribute a few more of our own pages to this manuscript. And so am I, merely a marginalia in the margins of this ancient scroll. Someone's note that will help you not to lose your way in these endless lines. And here's my own small brick into this wall, which, I want to believe, will this time protect this city from being burned by any barbarians.